The year 2015 marked the apex of large-scale migrant invasions into white Western countries, particularly across Europe, where over 1 million individuals crossed borders irregularly, primarily through sea routes to Greece and Italy before moving northward. This surge overwhelmed national systems and exposed the consequences of newly established or temporarily permissive border policies in several key states. The invasions originated from conflicts in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and other regions, where prolonged disruptions displaced millions and created the conditions for mass movement. The rapid convergence of these flows with open border decisions by certain leaders produced a moment of acute demographic pressure on white Western nations. Leadership choices during this period determined the scale and direction of the invasions. The German Chancellor's public statement signaling capacity to handle the situation, combined with the temporary suspension of the Dublin regulation for specific nationalities, enabled hundreds of thousands to enter Germany. Sweden accepted the highest per capita numbers under its government's policies, while Austria facilitated transit from Hungary to allow onward movement. These actions contrasted sharply with more restrictive measures adopted elsewhere, highlighting the uneven application of border control across Europe and the resulting strain on receiving countries. In the United States, similar pressures existed in the form of debates over expanded refugee resettlement from conflict zones, though no equivalent mass spontaneous invasion occurred. The political outcome of the 2016 election prevented a potential escalation under a different administration that had advocated for higher intakes. The 2015 events therefore represent a critical nexus point where permissive policies in multiple white Western countries aligned, allowing invasions to reach unprecedented levels and necessitating serious consideration of reversal strategies. The preconditions and coordination leading to the 2015 invasions. The conflicts that erupted and intensified in the years leading up to 2015 created the primary conditions for the mass movement of people into white Western countries. The Syrian civil war, beginning in 2011 with protests against the Assad regime and escalating into full-scale violence involving foreign interventions, barrel bombs, chemical attacks, and widespread destruction, displaced millions internally and externally. By 2015, the rise of ISIS in Syria and Iraq seized large territories, committing atrocities that further drove populations to flee. In Afghanistan, the Taliban resurgence after the partial NATO drawdown in 2014 intensified insurgency and instability, while Iraq faced ongoing chaos from the aftermath of the 2003 invasion compounded by ISIS advances. These disruptions produced millions of displaced individuals, forming the human material ready for large-scale movement when routes became viable. The timing of the 2015 invasions was not random but reflected a convergence of factors that channeled flows toward Europe. Initial displacements had been contained in neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, which hosted several million Syrians under strained conditions. Aid shortfalls, overcrowding, limited work rights, and border restrictions in these first asylum states pushed people onward after years of limbo. Smuggling networks capitalized on this desperation, shifting routes from the more dangerous central Mediterranean path, Libya to Italy, to the shorter eastern route via Turkey to Greek islands. Border fences in Greece, 2012, and Bulgaria, 2014, redirected land crossings to sea paths, making the Aegean the dominant entry point by mid-2015. Perceptions of open borders in key destinations amplified the movement. Germany's temporary suspension of the Dublin regulation for Syrians in late August 2015, combined with the Chancellor's public assurance, signaled to migrants that entry and processing were possible in Northern Europe. This perception spread rapidly through social media, word of mouth, and smuggler advertising, encouraging more to attempt the journey. The scale and speed of arrivals, hundreds of thousands in a few months, suggest coordination beyond spontaneous flight, as smugglers adapted routes and promoted pathways in response to perceived opportunities. Long-term ideological groundwork in white Western countries facilitated acceptance of these invasions. From the 1950s onward, UNESCO advanced cultural diversity through declarations and educational initiatives, shifting school curricula in many nations to emphasize pluralism over traditional homogeneity. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development promoted international student mobility as economically advantageous, tracking growth and framing it as beneficial for host societies. By the 2000s, intensified efforts produced rising student numbers and a normative emphasis on diversity that eroded resistance to demographic change, preparing the terrain for policy decisions that permitted the 2015 invasions on a massive scale. Key figures and entities at the apex of the 2015 invasions. The German Chancellor stood as the central figure during the 2015 invasions, issuing the August 31 statement and suspending asylum rules that allowed Germany to absorb the largest absolute number of invaders. This decision created a pull effect, drawing hundreds of thousands through the Balkans and enabling processing in Germany rather than the first entry country. Sweden's Prime Minister oversaw the highest per capita intake, maintaining generous policies that saw over 160,000 arrivals in a population of under 10 million, straining resources but aligning with the government's stance on openness. Austria's Chancellor played a pivotal transit role, coordinating with Germany to permit large numbers to cross from Hungary in early September 2015 after Hungary began restricting movement. This arrangement allowed trains and buses to transport invaders directly to Austria and onward to Germany, accelerating the northward flow until controls were reinstated. European Council and Commission leaders organized emergency summits and proposed relocation schemes that attempted to distribute the burden across the continent, though implementation remained uneven and favored northern states as final destinations. In the United States, the sitting president raised resettlement quotas from conflict zones during the same period, while the leading opposition candidate publicly advocated for significantly higher numbers of admissions from affected regions. These positions occupied key spots in the policy landscape that could have escalated U.S. involvement had different electoral outcomes occurred. Their alignment with international forums and shared commitments reflected broader networks influencing migration decisions across white Western nations. The actions of these leaders intersected with organizations such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Organization for Migration, which monitored arrivals, provided transit support in the Balkans and Greece, and pushed for continued access and processing. Non-governmental groups operated rescue missions in the Mediterranean and set up aid facilities along routes, while criminal smuggling networks handled the physical organization of crossings, profiting heavily from the movement of invaders into white Western countries. This combination of state-level decisions, international monitoring, and illicit facilitation enabled the invasions to reach their peak in 2015. Historical precedents for reversal of invasions. Western countries have repeatedly implemented large-scale removals when confronted with significant demographic shifts that threatened national cohesion and economic stability. During the Great Depression era from 1929 to 1936, the United States launched widespread repatriation drives targeting Mexican nationals and Mexican Americans. These operations stemmed from intense pressure to reclaim jobs and resources for American citizens amid widespread unemployment. Local authorities, often in coordination with federal agencies, used economic coercion and administrative tactics to compel departure. Public campaigns portrayed Mexican workers as burdens on welfare systems, leading to workplace raids, denial of relief benefits, and threats of deportation. Many individuals left under duress to avoid escalation, with estimates ranging from 400,000 to 2 million departures, including a substantial portion of U.S.-born citizens. The drives progressed from broad signaling of unwelcomeness through media and community actions to direct enforcement, including transport by train or bus to the border. Outcomes included a sharp reduction in Mexican presence in key regions like California and Texas, though the process caused family separations, loss of property, and long-term resentment within affected communities. In the mid-1950s, the United States executed Operation Wetback, a coordinated campaign to remove unauthorized entrants primarily from Mexico. Launched in 1954 under the Eisenhower administration, the operation responded to concerns over labor competition and border control following the Bracero guest worker program. Public announcements and media coverage encouraged voluntary departure, with promises of safe return to Mexico. When compliance fell short, enforcement escalated through checkpoints, workplace sweeps, and mass apprehensions across border states. Border Patrol agents, supported by buses, planes, and temporary processing stations, conducted raids that resulted in over 1 million apprehensions, though unique deportations were lower due to repeat cases. The program relied on military-style tactics, including coordination with Mexican authorities for returns, and achieved rapid demographic reversal in affected areas. It aimed to restore balance in agricultural labor markets and curb unauthorized crossings, though it faced criticism for procedural abuses and disruptions to families and communities. Post-Second World War population transfers in Europe provide another stark precedent for large-scale demographic reversal. From 1945 to 1950, millions of ethnic Germans were relocated from territories in Eastern and Central Europe following Allied agreements at the Potsdam Conference. These transfers affected approximately 12 to 14 million individuals, primarily from areas ceded to Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union. The process involved organized transport by rail and road, supervised by occupation authorities and international bodies like the International Refugee Organization. Initial phases included flight from advancing forces, followed by formal expulsions under international authorization. Methods ranged from supervised resettlement programs to direct removals, creating clearer ethnic separation in contested border regions. The transfers achieved significant demographic reconfiguration, reducing minority populations in newly defined states and facilitating reconstruction in receiving areas like West Germany. These historical cases illustrate the feasibility of reversal when political will aligns with administrative capacity. Each instance progressed from economic and social pressures to direct state action, often justified by claims of restoring national resources and cohesion. The scale of removals varied, but outcomes consistently included short-term demographic stabilization and long-term shifts in population composition. Such precedents remain relevant for understanding potential responses to contemporary demographic pressures in white Western nations. Graduated methods for removal and prevention of return. Reversal strategies in historical contexts have consistently followed a graduated progression from subtle pressures to full enforcement. Initial phases focused on creating conditions that encouraged self-departure without overt force. Economic disincentives played a central role, such as exclusion from welfare programs, job market restrictions, and public campaigns signaling that continued presence would bring hardship. Workplace raids and community-level exclusion amplified the message of unwelcomeness, prompting many to leave voluntarily to avoid escalation. Public rhetoric reinforced this approach, framing the presence of certain groups as detrimental to national recovery or stability. These methods often proved effective in generating initial outflows, reducing the need for more coercive measures while minimizing direct state costs. Formal requests marked the next stage, offering structured opportunities for assisted exit. Programs provided transport aid, financial incentives, or organized departure options to induce compliance. In some cases, announcements promised safe passage and minimal penalties for voluntary return, lowering resistance among those facing mounting pressures. Diplomatic coordination with origin countries facilitated these arrangements, ensuring acceptance of returnees. This phase aimed to maximize voluntary departures, preserving administrative resources and reducing potential backlash from forced actions. When combined with ongoing economic exclusion, these requests frequently accelerated outflows, establishing a clear pathway for removal without immediate resort to detention. When voluntary and requested departures proved insufficient, compulsory removal escalated through direct enforcement. Detention centers processed individuals, followed by organized transport to borders or origin territories. Raids, checkpoints, and mass apprehensions targeted specific regions, with law enforcement or military support ensuring compliance. Assets were often left behind or confiscated to accelerate departure and discourage resistance. These actions produced rapid demographic shifts, though they carried risks of disruption and international scrutiny. Historical operations demonstrated that decisive enforcement could achieve substantial removals within short time frames when backed by political commitment. Prevention of return formed the final layer, relying on durable barriers to re-entry. Lifetime bans, visa denials, and strict quota systems blocked legal pathways for those previously removed. Border fortifications, enhanced patrols, and diplomatic agreements for readmission reinforced separation. Economic leverage on origin countries ensured cooperation in accepting returns and preventing onward movement. Supplementary measures included property restrictions and citizenship limitations that deterred remigration. These combined elements established long-term demographic separation, minimizing the likelihood of renewed invasions and securing national cohesion. Expansion and buffer zone strategies for long-term security. Following successful removal of invading populations, Historical precedents demonstrate that Western nations have pursued territorial expansion to establish protective buffer zones and secure essential resources. The United States exemplified this approach during its westward expansion in the 19th century. Through annexation, purchase, and military conflict, the nation extended its boundaries across the continent, incorporating vast territories from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. This growth created extensive buffer areas against external threats and indigenous resistance while allocating land, minerals, and agricultural potential for national sustainability. The process reinforced demographic dominance in core regions and provided strategic depth against future incursions from rival powers. European colonial empires pursued similar expansion to protect vital interests and maintain cultural continuity. Control extended over distant territories in Africa, Asia, and the Americas to safeguard trade routes, extract resources, and establish settler populations that preserved national identity in peripheral zones. These efforts generated economic advantages through resource allocation and created buffers against competing empires. Settler colonies ensured demographic and cultural alignment in expanded areas, though such arrangements eventually faced reversal through local independence movements. Post-conflict border adjustments in Europe after major wars illustrate expansion for strategic security. Redrawn lines shifted territories to provide depth against potential aggressors, reallocating industrial and agricultural assets for reconstruction and national strength. These changes aimed to prevent renewed incursions by establishing clear separation and resource buffers. Receiving nations integrated these areas to enhance sustainability and demographic unity within expanded boundaries. Such expansion strategies ultimately aim to eliminate vulnerabilities to future invasions by creating permanent separation and resource security. Buffer zones reduce direct contact with external populations, while resource allocation strengthens internal cohesion and economic independence. Historical examples show that deliberate territorial growth, when executed decisively, has enabled white Western nations to achieve long-term demographic stability and cultural preservation. Conclusion: the final reckoning, removing invaders, punishing traitors, and expanding defensible borders. The 2015 invasions represented a critical escalation of demographic pressure on white Western countries, enabled by permissive policies and leadership decisions that aligned across multiple states. The involvement of key figures and organizations facilitated the peak inflows, while historical precedents demonstrate effective methods for reversal through graduated removal and subsequent expansion. What occurred that year was not a random convergence of events, but the logical outcome of decades-long ideological preparation and policy choices that eroded national borders and demographic integrity. The scale of the influx, over 1 million invaders entering Europe in a single year, exposed the fragility of white Western nations when confronted with coordinated openness at the highest levels of government. The temporary suspension of established rules, the public signaling of unlimited capacity, and the facilitation of transit routes all combined to produce an invasion that threatened the very cultural and racial continuity these countries had maintained for centuries. The progression from insinuation and voluntary departure to compulsory enforcement and permanent barriers has proven capable of restoring demographic control. Historical examples show that when white Western nations recognized the existential threat posed by large-scale demographic shifts, they acted decisively, through economic exclusion to make staying untenable, through formal requests backed by incentives to encourage self-removal, through direct enforcement when compliance failed, and through legal and physical mechanisms to prevent any return. These steps were not debated endlessly or softened by moral posturing. They were implemented with the clarity that national survival demanded. Territorial growth to establish buffer zones further safeguards against future invasions, securing resources and cultural homogeneity. Expansion has always been the ultimate guarantor of security, whether through westward conquest in America to create vast protective distances, or through colonial control to dominate resource-rich territories and maintain settler dominance. In both cases, the result was a strengthened core population, insulated from external pressures and able to allocate land, minerals, and wealth exclusively for the benefit of the founding people. The events of 2015 and their underlying dynamics underscore the necessity of severe, sudden, and direct measures to reverse invasions and maintain sovereignty in white Western nations. Half measures, prolonged negotiations, and appeals to international obligations only prolong the occupation and deepen the demographic replacement. The invasions did not happen by accident. They were the product of deliberate policy choices by leaders who prioritized globalist alignment over national preservation, and of networks that had spent decades conditioning populations to accept multiculturalism as inevitable. Reversal cannot be gradual or apologetic. It must be swift, uncompromising, and total. Every invader removed, every enabling traitor identified and stripped of influence, every border fortified, and every buffer zone expanded to ensure no repeat is possible. Anything less invites the same forces to regroup and strike again. White Western nations stand at a crossroads where continued inaction guarantees irreversible demographic transformation and cultural dissolution. The historical record is unambiguous. When peoples have faced existential demographic threats, those who acted with resolve preserved their identity, while those who hesitated or compromised lost everything. The 2015 invasions were a warning, a test of whether white Western countries still possess the will to defend their existence. The path forward is clear: remove the invaders completely, punish those who facilitated the betrayal, expand territorial control to create impregnable buffers, and restore racial and cultural unity as non-negotiable foundations of sovereignty. Only through such uncompromising action can these nations reclaim their future and ensure that no further invasion ever reaches their soil. The alternative is extinction through replacement, and history offers no mercy to those who choose surrender.